Welcome to Whisper After Midnight. Tonight we step into Louisiana, 1856, where court records and whispered testimonies describe a slave boy whose cruelty shocked even a brutal era. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value carefully researched true history, please subscribe. Every episode takes long hours of digging through primary sources, conflicting accounts, and forgotten archives to separate fact from myth, so your support truly keeps this work alive. In 1856, Louisiana stood at the heart of the Deep South's plantation economy, a place where wealth was measured in land, sugar, cotton, and human lives. The law existed, but it did not exist equally. Enslaved people were legally classified as property, not persons, which meant protection under the courts was minimal to non-existent. Plantation owners wielded near absolute authority. Overseers enforced discipline with brutality, and any violence that occurred within plantation boundaries was rarely questioned by outside officials. Sheriffs and judges often deferred to the word of slaveholders, assuming that whatever happened behind those gates was a matter of management, not justice. This imbalance created an environment where cruelty could grow unnoticed. Daily life on plantations was governed by fear of punishment, fear of separation, fear of death. Families could be broken apart by sale at any moment, and complaints, even whispered ones, risked violent retaliation. Enslaved communities relied on silence and survival rather than truth and testimony. In such a system, violence did not need secrecy to thrive, it needed only indifference. Louisiana's geography added another layer. Isolated plantations, dense swamps, and miles of rural land made oversight nearly impossible. News traveled slowly, often distorted by rumor or deliberately buried. When deaths occurred, they were explained away as illness, accidents, or escape attempts. The legal framework allowed these explanations to stand without investigation, especially when the victims were enslaved families with no voice in court. It was within this world, where law protected power, distance protected secrets, and silence protected brutality, that the story of one extraordinarily cruel slave boy would unfold. Not because the era was uniquely violent, but because it allowed violence to hide in plain sight. The records never give the boy a full name, only fragments, inconsistencies, and descriptions filtered through the voices of those who owned him. In Louisiana during the 1850s, this was common. Enslaved children were often listed by age, physical traits, or a single given name. Their past erased the moment they entered bondage. Where this boy was born remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest he came from an inland parish, sold after a failed harvest. Others hint he was brought from another state after his original owner died. What is certain is that by the time he appeared in plantation records, his childhood was already marked by displacement and loss. He was taken young, so young that witnesses later argued he had never known a life without captivity. Early captivity shaped him in ways no one cared to understand. Enslaved children were expected to work almost as soon as they could walk, performing small but relentless tasks, carrying water, watching livestock, cleaning quarters. Discipline was harsh and immediate. Punishments were public, designed not only to correct the child, but to warn everyone watching. Fear was the first language he learned. Unlike many children who broke under this pressure, the boy was described as observant, quiet, attentive, and quick to understand the plantation's unspoken rules. He learned who held power, who could hurt him, and who could be hurt without consequence. Older enslaved people later recalled that he watched punishments closely, not with tears, but with focus. At the time, this was dismissed as numbness, a survival response in a cruel world. As he grew, he was passed between households, never staying long enough to form stable bonds. Each transfer stripped away another piece of identity. No family ties, no community roots, no consistent guidance, only shifting masters and changing expectations. Violence followed him from place to place, sometimes as discipline, sometimes as spectacle. In a system that denied him humanity, empathy was never nurtured, and accountability was never taught. By the time he reached adolescence, those around him no longer saw a child. They saw a tool, someone shaped by captivity, hardened by punishment, and dangerously aware of how little his actions might matter in the eyes of the law. His origins remained a mystery, but his transformation had already begun. Forged in a world that treated cruelty as routine and silence as safety, Plantations in mid-19th century Louisiana operated under a rigid hierarchy that resembled a small, lawless kingdom. At the top stood the owner, often absent, leaving daily control to overseers and foremen whose authority was rarely questioned. Beneath them were trusted enslaved workers, drivers, stable hands, house servants, granted limited power to enforce rules among others. This structure was designed to keep order through division, rewarding obedience with small privileges and punishing resistance with terror. Power flowed downward, but accountability did not. Overseers were encouraged to maintain productivity at any cost, and cruelty was often mistaken for discipline. Beatings, confinement, and psychological torment were normalized tools of control. When violence occurred between enslaved people, it was frequently ignored unless it disrupted work or threatened property. This neglect created dangerous spaces where abuse could grow without consequence. Within this system, the boy learned that authority was not tied to morality, but to proximity to power. He watched overseers inflict pain and walk away unchallenged. He saw favored workers exert control over others, sometimes more brutally than the masters themselves, believing harshness would protect their own standing. Violence became currency, proof of loyalty, strength, and usefulness. The boy was gradually placed in positions that allowed him to act with minimal supervision, guarding livestock, delivering messages at night, overseeing younger children. These roles, though minor, carried unchecked influence. Those beneath him feared retaliation, while those above him paid little attention, assuming order was being maintained. In this gap between responsibility and oversight, abuse flourished. What made the situation especially dangerous was the plantation's habit of blaming victims rather than questioning the system. Injuries were explained as accidents, disappearances as runaways, deaths as sickness. Each excuse reinforced the idea that suffering was expected and unworthy of scrutiny. The boy absorbed this lesson, well, understanding that harm could be hidden behind routine explanations. The plantation hierarchy did not create cruelty on its own, but it provided the perfect cover for it. By rewarding silence, excusing violence, and distributing power without accountability, the system allowed one young individual to act with growing confidence. In a world where domination was modeled daily and consequences were rare, abuse was not only possible, it was practically invited. The earliest signs that something was wrong did not arrive as shocking crimes, but as small, unsettling incidents that were easy to dismiss in a violent world. Plantation logs and later testimonies mention unexplained injuries among enslaved children, bruises that did not match work accidents, cuts that appeared overnight, and sudden illnesses following encounters with the boy. At first, these were written off as the harsh realities of plantation life. Children fell, tools slicked, sickness spread quickly in crowded quarters. No one looked deeper. Whispers began among the enslaved families long before any authority took notice. Mothers warned their children not to be alone near him. Elders noticed patterns. The same boy was often nearby when someone was hurt. Livestock was found mutilated, or food stores were mysteriously poisoned. Still, fear kept these observations quiet. Accusations without proof could lead to punishment, or worse, so suspicion stayed within hushed conversations after dark. What made these early acts alarming was their intent. Witnesses later recalled that the injuries were not random. They were targeted, repeated, and escalating. A child shoved into a canal by accident. A sleeping family member struck with a tool and left unconscious. Animals harmed not for food or discipline, but seemingly for control. Each incident tested boundaries, probing how much could be done without consequence. Overseers noticed disruptions but focused only on productivity. When questioned, the boy deflected blame onto others or circumstances, and his explanations were accepted without challenge. The system was not designed to investigate patterns, only outcomes. If work continued, the matter was closed. This response taught a dangerous lesson: suspicion without authority meant nothing. By the time plantation records finally hinted at concern, short notes about trouble, disturbance, or disciplinary issues, the behavior had already progressed. The first recorded acts were not treated as warnings, they were treated as inconveniences. In a place where suffering was ordinary and accountability was rare, those early signs were allowed to fade into the background, setting the stage for far greater horrors to come. Long before any written record acknowledged danger, The truth moved quietly through the enslaved community in the form of rumors. These were not idle stories meant to entertain, they were survival tools. On plantations, information traveled through whispers after sunset, exchanged while drawing water, tending fires, or rocking children to sleep. When someone was hurt, missing, or found dead under unclear circumstances, families talked among themselves, piecing together patterns that no one in power cared to see. The boy's name began to surface again and again in these hushed exchanges. Someone would say he had been nearby before a child disappeared. Another would mention seeing him leave a cabin late at night. Others spoke of the way he watched suffering, not with fear, but with calm curiosity. No single story was enough to accuse him openly, but together they formed a growing sense of dread. Mothers began pulling their children closer. Families avoided certain paths after dark. Elders warned younger ones never to be alone when he was around. Fear kept these rumors contained. Speaking openly to overseers was dangerous. Accusing another enslaved person could lead to brutal punishment for both the accuser and the accused. Worse still, if the accusation disrupted plantation order, the entire community might suffer retaliation. Silence, though costly, felt safer than truth. So the rumors stayed within the quarters, gaining detail but losing urgency with each retelling. What made the situation more tragic was the lack of protection even within the community. Enslaved families could warn one another, but they could not intervene directly without risking severe consequences. They were trapped in a system that forced them to watch danger grow while remaining powerless to stop it. The boy, meanwhile, sensed this fear. He understood that people avoided him, that his presence changed the air, and instead of restraining him, it seemed to embolden him. These rumors were the first collective recognition that something was deeply wrong. They were the enslaved families to name a threat in a world that denied them a voice. By the time the whispers reached the edges of official awareness, they were no longer warnings. They were echoes of tragedies already endured. Overseers were the true gatekeepers of plantation life, positioned between owners and the enslaved, and their silence proved as destructive as any act of violence. In Louisiana during the 1850s, overseers were hired to maximize output, not ensure safety. Their performance was judged by crops harvested and order maintained, not by the well-being of those forced to labor under them. Anything that did not directly threaten productivity was treated as irrelevant or deliberately ignored. When early complaints surfaced in indirect ways, missed work, frightened children, unexplained injuries, overseers chose convenience over investigation. Looking deeper meant paperwork, confrontation, and the possibility of blame falling upward. It was far easier to accept simple explanations: accidents, sickness, disobedience punished by someone else. In this environment, silence was not passive, it was strategic. Some overseers were aware that something was wrong. Later testimonies hinted that warnings were brushed aside with phrases like, "handle your own," or "don't bring me trouble." The boy's behavior was viewed as an internal matter among the enslaved, not a concern worthy of authority. As long as he followed orders when watched and did not disrupt the fields, his actions went unscrutinized. Worse still, the plantation system often rewarded cruelty. Overseers who ruled through fear were seen as effective. Violence was normalized, even admired, when it kept others in line. In such a culture, a boy displaying dominance and control could be mistaken for discipline rather than danger. The overseer's failure was not just neglect, it was misinterpretation. This silence sent a clear message: there would be no consequences. Each ignored incident reinforced the boy's understanding that oversight was an illusion. Authority existed only when it served power, not justice. The overseer's refusal to act did more than allow cruelty to continue. It gave it room to grow, unchecked and increasingly bold, until silence itself became complicit in what followed. At some point, the pattern shifted. What had once been cruel, impulsive acts became deliberate and planned. Witnesses later described a change in the boy's behavior, less chaotic, more controlled. He no longer acted only in moments of anger or opportunity. He began choosing when, where, and who. This was the moment when cruelty hardened into calculation. The escalation followed a chilling logic. He learned which areas of the plantation were rarely patrolled, which hours passed without oversight, and which families were already vulnerable, those with sick members, the elderly, or very young children. He understood that deaths within these families would raise fewer questions, explained away as fever, exhaustion, or misfortune. The system itself provided the cover. Accounts suggest that he tested methods quietly. Injuries became fatal but looked accidental. A push near deep water. A blow delivered where bruises would be hidden. Food tampered with just enough to weaken, not immediately kill. Each death was a lesson, what drew attention, and what did not. When no punishment followed, his confidence grew. What terrified the enslaved community most was the absence of visible emotion. Survivors later recalled that he did not panic or flee after these deaths. He returned to work, followed orders, and blended back into routine life. This ability to separate violence from daily existence made him harder to suspect and even harder to stop. Fear deepened because the danger no longer announced itself. Families began disappearing not all at once, but piece by piece. A child gone. A parent found dead days later. Another family collapsing under unexplained tragedy. The cruelty was no longer about dominance alone. It had become systematic, leaving entire households shattered before anyone outside the quarters noticed. By the time the deaths could no longer be ignored, the damage was already done. The escalation had thrived in silence, nurtured by indifference, and protected by a system that refused to see enslaved lives as worth saving. What began as cruelty ended as calculated destruction, carried out in plain sight, yet hidden by the very world that allowed it. Night was when the plantation truly became lawless. After sunset, overseers retreated, patrols thinned, and the enslaved quarters were left to police themselves. Darkness swallowed distance, and sounds that might have drawn attention during the day dissolved into the swamp air. It was under this cover that entire families began to unravel. The attacks were not loud raids or sudden massacres. They were quiet, precise, and staggered. One night a father would fail to wake. Another night a child would vanish from a pallet without a sound. Sometimes a mother would be found injured beyond recovery, with no clear explanation. Each loss weakened the family left behind, stripping away protection, strength, and witnesses. By the time the full pattern emerged, there was no single moment to point to, only a trail of absence. Survivors later described the psychological toll as much as the physical one. Families slept in fear, taking turns staying awake, holding children close, listening for footsteps. Trust eroded. When danger comes from outside, a community can unite. When it comes from within, suspicion poisons even the strongest bonds. Parents questioned whether to warn others, knowing that accusations could bring collective punishment. The boy's presence loomed in these nights like a shadow. Even when he was not seen, families believed he was near. That fear alone was enough to fracture households. People fled cabins, separated for safety, or sent children away to relatives on distant parts of the plantation. In trying to survive, families were torn apart by the very terror meant to destroy them. By morning, the plantation returned to routine. Work resumed. Losses were noted only as missing labor. Entire family lines quietly ended without ceremony. Their destruction hidden behind sunrise and silence. Under the cover of night, violence did not just kill individuals. It erased families, leaving behind empty cabins and unanswered questions that daylight refused to acknowledge. As the boy's actions grew bolder and families continued to vanish, a pervasive sense of fear spread throughout the enslaved community. Unlike the earlier rumors, which were tentative and speculative, this fear was constant, shaping every movement and decision. People learned to speak in whispers, using coded language or gestures to alert others without drawing the attention of overseers. A slight nod might warn, "Stay away," or a quietly placed object could signal danger in a certain area. Every word carried weight. Every glance a possible warning. The boy's reputation preceded him. Mothers warned their children never to wander alone. Elders cautioned the young to avoid certain cabins, corners of the yard, or paths through the fields where he might be lurking. Stories of injuries or disappearances were shared in fragments, careful to avoid naming names in case an overseer overheard. Even routine tasks, fetching water, tending animals, or collecting firewood, were undertaken in groups for protection. Solidarity became a survival strategy. Fear also shaped the social structure within the enslaved community. Trust became both precious and scarce. Individuals were judged on their ability to heed warnings and protect one another. Those who ignored advice or wandered out of sight were blamed if misfortune struck. creating pressure to follow collective safety measures even in dire circumstances. Yet this fear had limits. The system itself offered no true protection. Even the most careful precautions could fail. The boy, emboldened by previous acts and the silence of the overseers, continued to exploit gaps in the community's defenses. His presence created a constant tension, one that made work unbearable, sleep uneasy, and every small act of independence a calculated risk. The whispered warnings, while vital, could not stop the cycle of destruction entirely. They were survival tools in a world that refused to intervene, a shadow network of communication built out of necessity. But even these whispered cautions could not undo the growing tragedy, only attempt to delay it, as the boy's calculated cruelty continued to advance unchecked. In 1856 Louisiana, the legal and social systems were designed to protect property, not people, especially not enslaved people. This framework made it almost impossible for the boy's escalating acts of violence to be documented or punished. Any evidence of wrongdoing was filtered through layers of bias, overseers who turned a blind eye, plantation owners who assumed accidents were part of daily life, and courts that only recognized the lives and property of white citizens as worthy of protection. The boy's victims, all enslaved, had virtually no legal voice, and their suffering was systematically erased. Records that did exist were vague, incomplete, or deliberately misleading. Plantation logs might note a missing child, or a sudden death, with no explanation. If the overseer suspected foul play, the report would often frame it as negligence or illness, not deliberate harm. Even testimonies collected later were fragmented, relying on second-hand accounts whispered among the enslaved. By the time anyone outside the plantation might hear of the pattern, much of the evidence had already disappeared or been obscured by socially accepted excuses. The boy himself understood the system. He learned which actions could go unnoticed and which might draw attention. Injuries were inflicted in ways that would appear accidental. Livestock could be killed or mutilated without leaving traceable proof. Food could be sabotaged subtly, making illness seem natural. Each act of cruelty was calculated to exploit the systemic blind spots of a society that devalued the lives of the enslaved. Race and status created a protective shield around him. To white authorities, he was a child, a property, yes, but ultimately expendable if it prevented disruption. To the enslaved community, he was a terror, but powerless to challenge him directly without risking severe punishment themselves. In this environment, evidence was not just hidden. It was actively protected by the structures of inequality. This invisible cover allowed cruelty to escalate from secretive acts to devastatingly calculated murders, leaving devastation behind while the outside world remained oblivious. Despite the boy's careful cruelty and the protective veil of the plantation system, there came a point when the pattern of violence became too glaring to remain unnoticed. By the mid-1850s, several families had vanished entirely, and isolated incidents that once seemed accidental now formed a disturbing trend. Even overseers could no longer dismiss it as ordinary hardship. The deaths and disappearances had accumulated to the point that they disrupted plantation operations, attracting attention from neighboring planters, county officials, and eventually the courts. Reports began to trickle in, though often fragmented and contradictory. Local magistrates noted multiple deaths in a single plantation, unusual for an area supposedly governed by strict labor expectations and overseer supervision. Rumors that had long circulated among the enslaved population reached ears in the wider white community, usually through intermediaries, other plantation workers, itinerant traders, or visitors who noticed missing families and shared concern. These fragments were pieced together into a rough picture of escalating violence. The boy's increasing boldness accelerated this exposure. Unlike his earlier acts, which were subtle and isolated, later acts could no longer be explained away. A family discovered dead in their quarters, an older child found with suspicious injuries, and livestock mutilated in ways that could not be attributed to accident or illness. All drew scrutiny. Officials, previously indifferent, were forced to acknowledge that multiple unexplained deaths had occurred under one roof. Even then, the response was cautious. The law's racial bias and the social norms of the time meant authorities often prioritized property over justice. Investigations focused more on the damage to plantation output than on the human toll. Still, for the first time, Someone with authority questioned the narrative of routine accidents. Witnesses were interviewed, overseers were pressed for explanations, and records of the boy's presence during each incident were finally noted. This turning point marked the beginning of accountability, however delayed and incomplete. It was a rare moment where systemic indifference collided with undeniable evidence, forcing the machinery of law and oversight to engage, even minimally, with the horrors that had unfolded largely in secret. The boy, once able to act with near impunity, now faced attention he had previously avoided. But by then, the damage to families and the community was profound and largely irreversible. When the authorities finally intervened, what emerged was a fragmented and often contradictory record of events, a legal paper trail that revealed both the boy's actions and the societal blind spots that allowed them. Plantation logs, witness statements, and sparse court documents were collected, but the information was inconsistent. Dates didn't always match. Victims' names were sometimes omitted or replaced with vague descriptors like child of color or female slave. The boy's own identity remained incomplete, recorded only by age, physical traits, or nicknames, leaving historians to piece together a puzzle with crucial pieces missing. Testimonies were equally complicated. Survivors who dared speak of the boy's crimes faced fear and pressure, both from white authorities and from overseers who wanted the plantation's reputation protected. Their accounts often conflicted, not out of deception, but because of trauma, fear of retribution, and the passage of time. The overseer's statements, meanwhile, often minimized incidents, framing deaths as accidents or blaming other enslaved individuals. These contradictions made it nearly impossible to establish a clear timeline or understand the full scale of his actions. The court documents reflected the racial and social biases of the time. Evidence that might have been compelling today, physical traces of injuries, eyewitness accounts from enslaved people, was often dismissed as unreliable. Enslaved witnesses were considered legally incapable of testifying against white or mixed-race individuals, which meant much of the most direct evidence was excluded. Even when the boy was the focus, the documents carefully avoided framing him as fully responsible. Instead, they spoke in euphemisms, citing disturbances or misfortune rather than deliberate acts of violence. These gaps and contradictions have haunted historians ever since. By the time the trial concluded, or what little record survived, the full story was obscured. Names were lost, numbers undercounted, and atrocities diminished by language designed to soften their reality. What remains is a chilling skeleton of truth, offering glimpses of terror and devastation, but leaving much to speculation. It is a record of cruelty allowed to flourish in silence, and a reminder that history often remembers only fragments of suffering when those harmed had no voice. Even after the boy's actions came to the attention of authorities, much of what he did remained buried, hidden by the biases, silences, and indifference of the era. Plantation records were incomplete, court documents were vague, and the voices of those most affected, the enslaved families, were systematically erased from official accounts. Over time, the case slipped from public memory, remembered only in scattered testimonies, second-hand stories, and occasional mentions in historical records of Louisiana slavery. To many, it became an obscure footnote, overshadowed by broader narratives of plantation life and the politics of the Antebellum South. Yet the legacy of his cruelty persisted, if quietly. Among descendants of the enslaved community, oral histories preserved fragments of the story warnings whispered at night, lessons about survival, and the memory of families torn apart without justice. These stories became part of the communal knowledge, passed down as cautionary tales and warnings about human nature, power, and the fragility of safety in a world built on inequality. For historians and modern readers, the case also serves as a stark example of how systemic injustice enables horror. It demonstrates that cruelty is not only the result of individual malice, but can be cultivated and concealed by societal structures. Plantation hierarchies, legal biases, and social indifference allowed a young boy's acts of violence to escalate unchecked, leaving devastation in their wake. The story is difficult to confront because it challenges our understanding of innocence, childhood, and morality in a context stripped of fairness and accountability. It reminds us that history is often incomplete, shaped as much by what was hidden as by what was recorded. But by uncovering these fragments today, Through careful research, archival digging, and acknowledgement of overlooked voices, we preserve the memory of those who suffered and confront the uncomfortable truths of the past. In this way, the boy's story endures not as a tale of heroism or notoriety, but as a haunting reminder cruelty can thrive in silence, and the legacy of injustice lingers long after the individuals involved are gone. It is a story the world nearly forgot, and one that still demands attention if we are to understand the human cost of systemic oppression.